Uh-oh, what happened? What did you do? Oh, crap.
Okay, good.
Well, you folks, we're just going to go to Gary's presentation here. Just want to let you know that after we get done with the presentation, we will be bringing up a survey slide. So if you need to get CEU credits, please wait till the end to do that. And we will also be answering questions at the end of the webinar. We're going to let Gary do his presentation and then answer those at the end. So hold on, Gary, I'm going to bring up your presentation and then we'll get started.
Now,
Everybody.
hey, Robin, can you hear me on the microphone, though, on my headset?
Yes.
You can, great, because I can't hear me. All right, so if you can hear me, I'm going to start going through, even though nothing's coming into me from my headset. Oops. Okay. All right, I guess this is going to be a leap of faith here that you can actually hear me because I can't hear anything. I like that, Gary. Move the mic a little bit away. Okay, good. Tell me when the mic. I can see your comments. I can't hear anything. So tell me, is the microphone better now? Perfect. Great.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Excellent. So here we go. We have a little bit of time left on here. The reason that I've kind of put this presentation together was for another seminar that was given in the metropolitan area on emerald ash borer management, and this project is less about using chemicals and killing insects, and it's more about working with communities that have very, very limited capacity to even manage the problem if they do have it. So with that kind of a beginning, we'll go into what this is all about. You're looking at a fairly typical aerial view of a rural community. It could be anywhere in the country. This happens to be in Minnesota. And our emphasis for this project, when we started working with communities in 2009, the emphasis was on rural communities, and it was because of our philosophy that in Minnesota, in the metropolitan area, there are it's an 11-county metropolitan area. There are a lot of communities, and there's kind of a lot of mutual support. Minneapolis helps St. Paul, Roseville helps Shoreview, etc. So there are a lot of built-in connections here just because of proximity that it really doesn't exist in rural Minnesota. So rural Minnesota, the communities are more isolated, and so pretty much have to figure out how to handle things on their own. So our intent was to work with these communities to help them build the capacity within the communities by engaging the citizens in this process of discovering how vulnerable they were to emerald ash borer and getting them involved in some type of management strategy. So that's a little bit of the beginning on this. If you look at the state of Minnesota, excuse me, you can see I'm going to focus a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to focus on Morris, Minnesota. That the arrow is going to the little purple circle around it. As you look around the state, though, you're going to notice. Let me see if I can click on this fancy little arrow. Here we go. I'm also going to be referring to some work we've done in Hibbing. This year, we're working in finishing up with Ely and Bemidji. We've worked with Crookston. So if you kind of look at the stars around the state, none of them are really within the metropolitan area. So, and again, as I mentioned, that was done on purpose. We wanted to work with the communities that are a little bit more isolated. The map to the left gives you a little bit more of an idea how we distributed the communities around the state that we worked with. We were trying to hit the major ecosystems. So if you look at the major ecosystems in Minnesota, and if you follow the little arrow around the border, what I'm doing is outlining the part of Minnesota that's cold and snowy. Yeah, that is tongue-in-cheek, kind of. But we do have these different ecosystems within the state, especially southeast Minnesota tends to have the most rainfall, the most diversity in plant material, and obviously the western part of the state, the Red River Valley, the northern glaciated plains, is the harshest part of the state in terms of extremely hot winters, a lot of wind. It's the prairie. So there's not a whole lot to stop things. And in that part of the state, one of the things that makes it livable for people is canopy cover. And in particular in that part of the state, one of the native trees that does very well, or has done very well in the past, has been green ash. So this again emphasizes the importance of trees, the importance of trees to a community in that part of the state, and in particular the importance of ash in that part of the state. The other thing we were trying to work with in these communities is a variety of sizes, population sizes, because population size generally will give us kind of an interesting distribution of how decisions are made in a community. So if you look at the metropolitan area with St. Paul is a community that has a very strong mayor. Minneapolis is a community that has a very strong park board commission. So it's a little bit different the way politically decisions are made. And then the same holds true when you get into greater Minnesota. Are you working with a community like, we'll go down to Hendricks. Hendricks is a population of 750 people. You'll meet the mayor later on in this presentation. And versus the largest community in greater Minnesota we've worked with is Rochester, which is about 110,000 people. So, the way decisions are made in these communities, the way people become engaged in these communities varies a lot. So it played well with our project and our efforts to get people engaged in the process. Oh, I wish I could hear people talking. So how did we start? This was in 2009 when we started approaching the communities, and I prepared letters that I would send. I went back up a little bit, go back to that map. So we selected communities around the state to try to give us a pretty good distribution of population densities and then ecosystems around the state. So are we in the northern woods? Are we in southeast Minnesota? Are we in the Red River Valley? Yes. And then do we have populations less than 1,000, between 1 and 5,000, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once we kind of selected some communities within these areas that we felt would be good candidates for working with. The next thing I tried to do, based on my experience working with communities around the state, is try to find communities that had a history of active volunteerism. So there was actually quite a bit of selection, pre-selection, before we began working with the communities in terms of I wanted to be able to select the most winnable situations possible. Okay, so some people can still hear me. Good, I'll move the microphone a little bit. So the letters then that were sent out to communities explained what the project was about and requested whether or not they would like to be part of this program. And part of this program did involve citizen engagement, community engagement, but it also involved a community that would enable the volunteers. So I didn't want to have a situation, or we didn't want to have a situation where we got volunteers active in a process, they did a lot of work, and then the city would say, oh, that's very nice of you, here's a chicken dinner, goodbye. We wanted to have communities that would actually enable the process, so would help out with the process of training, would help out with the process of getting citizens involved, and would give them a voice, would respect the work that they did, and help them out in a lot of different ways. So that was kind of the long, slow process. This was a very slow process. It took months and months and months before we finally got the communities that we originally started with. So community cooperation was absolutely critical with these areas. There were a lot of communities that said, oh yeah, we would love to have you come in and work with volunteers and get all this information. That would be wonderful. But there were not as many communities that agreed to empower the citizens. So as we go through and I talk about the different communities, I want to pat them on the back, because these are communities that did empower the volunteers, which was a very important part of this process. So the gentleman to the left in this picture is the city engineer for Hibbing, Minnesota. And Hibbing does not have a forestry department, they have a parks department, but this particular person ended up being the real spark plug for the community of Hibbing. He was the person that really linked the city to the volunteers, made sure that work got done, and that volunteers were actually respected and the information they collected was used. Second step was getting the community involved. And there are a couple ways that that can be accomplished. One of the ways that can be accomplished is for me to go to a community and try to find volunteers. The problem with that is that, I don't know everybody in the community. So the process that we used is we would have the community, whether it's the Parks Department or Public Works Department, give us a list of known volunteers within that community. And these could be people that belong to Rotarian clubs, Lions clubs, garden club, master gardeners, anything. Once they gave us that list of people, then we would contact the people. So it was the beginning of getting the actual community, the city, the Parks Department, or the Public Works Department involved in the process by supplying us with a list of potential volunteers. At the same time, so we're working with the city decision makers, we're working with volunteers, and then we started working with the community as a whole. And the principal way that we did this was a series of articles that we would submit. Sometimes in a community they did not have, some of the communities are so small they didn't have a local newspaper, but there was a county newspaper. Or maybe there was a newsletter that would come out monthly or bi-monthly or something from the Parks Department, etc. So we would use any type of mass communication that we could to start informing the community of what was going on, emphasizing that this process, even though the University of Minnesota was part of it, even though the Forest Service and the Department of Natural Resources in the state and the Extension Service were helping fund this, that this was really a community project and it was being accomplished with community volunteers, and the information was going to help the community. I think one of the battles that I encounter when I work with the community is everybody thinks I'm conducting research. And, for some people they find that interesting, and for other people it's an immediate disconnect. Wonderful research. I don't really care about that. But when they could realize that the information that was being gathered and the end product was actually going to help their community, it started bringing up this affinity between the community and the actual process. And, we actually got a lot of volunteers this way too. People that originally weren't part of the process became part of the process after they read some of the articles. And sometimes, they helped out on a very limited basis. And then other times, They became very, very involved. Also, with these articles, we tried to explain, subtly that there was an insect pest coming to Minnesota. In this case, it's already in Minnesota, and this insect pest had the potential of causing a lot of damage. And so really the purpose of this whole project was to determine a community's vulnerability to this, and whether or not this community needed to worry, or if they were relatively immune from catastrophic losses, or if they needed to start planning for the future. And so this became kind of a long process of outreach and education for the community. And if you're thinking to yourselves, good grief, this must have taken forever. Yes, it did take forever. I think when you get involved in these processes, you pretty much turn off the timeline and get ready to start writing letters for extensions. The third step now is we have buy-in from the city, we have buy-in from the good people who live in the community, and we have our volunteers. Volunteer training began with basically surveying the volunteers, and I do try to keep in mind that these people are volunteers. They are not indentured servants. They're not being paid, and so I try to accommodate them as well as we can. And we let them set the training schedule. Is it going to be strictly several evenings? Is it going to be stretched out over a month? Is it going to be all accomplished within a week? Will we have long training days like on a Saturday? It's pretty much up to the community. And a lot of that is determined by the demographics of the community. You're looking at a scene from Hutchinson, Minnesota, which was just a wonderful community to work with. It fell into that community of between 10 and 15,000 people. And if you look at some of the volunteers, we had volunteers as young as 15 years old and as mature as 80 years old. And it's a lot of fun to see people working together for a common cause in a situation like that. It really does break down a lot of age barriers and a lot of age prejudice too. But the training then is focused on what we felt would be the most important parts of this. And obviously tree identification is pretty important, very important. So that was one of those constant contacts throughout the training. Is we were, no matter what the topic was for the evening or the day, we would keep coming back to, all right, let's do a little bit of tree identification. One of the things that we learned early on is that normal people do not like dichotomous keys, and I don't blame them. I'm an abnormal person, and I don't like dichotomous keys. But we experimented with so many ways of helping people learn how to identify trees, and starting off with the keys. One of our more successful tactics in one of the communities is during our pre-sample of these communities, we had a really good idea of what were the most common trees. So we would take our groups during the training session, and we would go out to, for instance, a silver maple. And right away we'd say, all right, this is a silver maple. But how would you describe this to somebody, your friend or your mother, or a child or something? Looking at this tree, what are the things about this that would help you remember that it's a maple? So that was kind of fun. It got people to look at the tree a little bit closer. It got them to use their own imagination, their own words. And I feel really comfortable that some of these alternative techniques for learning how to identify trees were actually very successful. And one of my graduate students that is still connected to these projects is working on volunteer accuracy. And I'm very, very pleased to say that when we finish with a community, the graduate student goes back and randomly selects some of the trees that were surveyed or inventoried and checks the accuracy of the data. And the most accurate data collected is the identification of the trees. So I feel very, very good about the way that's kind of evolved. But along with that, we provided training on measuring trees, DBH, Some of the communities go for circumference at breast height. We kind of customize it to the community. We don't come in and say, hi, we're from the university and we're here to save you. It's more like, hi, we're from the university, we're going to do everything we can to help you. And that includes learning how to learn. So some of the communities were a little bit different on measuring trunk diameter, and we accommodated that just by when we set up the spreadsheets, we would put in conversions formulas. So if a community collected the information by circumference, it would automatically convert it to DBH. We also collected canopy spread, condition rating. And one of the other things a little bit unusual about this too is we surveyed and inventoried both public and private property too. So this was a really complete, good picture of the urban forest in these communities. As part of the research, now I told you earlier that we weren't conducting research, but I lied. We were, and we are still conducting research, and the research really is about community capacity and the ability to engage citizens in the management of their community, in particular the urban forest. So there is a lot of surveying that we do, and we try to do this as gently and subtly as possible and non-academic. So we have surveys that we call pre-surveys. What we're looking at again are demographics. We're looking at attitudes, how people feel about trees, how they feel about their community, the way trees are being managed, etc. And obviously when everything is concluded, then we have post-surveys, and then we have 1 year later post-surveys too. So we try to stay in constant contact with these people to look at, was there any change in their attitude, in their behavior? Did they get involved in more volunteer projects, and specifically did they get involved in more projects within the management of trees in their community, or management of trees on their own private property? One of the things that we found that was kind of interesting was a typical volunteer. And as this kind of settled out to the bottom, your typical volunteer is somebody that's lived in the community for about 20 years. Now, that doesn't mean that they're a retired person. That could be somebody that's 19 or 20 years old. But I think what it does is it indicates kind of this heartfelt connection with their community. And in the future, that's one of the things that we have used is we try to target groups that have stable community citizens, people that have either grown up in the community or have lived there for quite a while. Those are the ones that we know are most likely going to become volunteers and active volunteers. Just, I don't know, it holds true for Minnesota. So if you look at the lower right, this is one of our tree ID techniques that ended up being kind of cool and worked out really well. I have some really talented people that work with me, and we created these tree ID cards. So one of the things that we emphasize is that the inventory does take place in leaf-on season. So in Minnesota, you got to be fast. It's not a real long season, but we made these color cards, and then we sealed them in plastic, so they're nice and weatherproof. And they would have pictures of the trees, leaves, flowers, fruits, everything. So it's a very visual assessment of the trees, and it worked out really, really well. Our first group of communities, we put them through the training, which, and as we started out, it was about 16 hours of training. And then at the conclusion of the training, they would begin the inventory, and we would say, we'll continue to provide technical support throughout the whole process. Just give us a call. We'll be there. Doesn't matter where you're at. We'll come. And it's interesting, too, when you provide training, when you finish up with training, if you ask people, are there any questions? No. So you understand everything we went through? Yeah. Nothing's fuzzy at all. Nope. Most of the questions actually come about when they're in the field, starting the inventory. So after the first 6 communities, we changed our technical support a little bit. At the conclusion of the training, for the first 2 to 3 weeks that the volunteers are actually out in the field working, we just hang around. We walk the streets with them. And if they have questions, then we answer the questions immediately, because most of the time the questions come up when they're inventoried. And we found that giving that 2 to 3 weeks of support right at the beginning just made a phenomenal difference in the accuracy of the inventories. Also, in the upper left picture, we color code people. So if a community volunteer has gone through the training, the complete training, they're a volunteer leader, and they get a forest green t-shirt with community tree inventory team written on it. If there's somebody from the project team from the university, they're wearing a maroon and gold shirt. And then if it's a daily volunteer, it's a maroon shirt with gold lettering. So there's a little bit of community pride in becoming one of the green shirts. And we emphasize that when people are out collecting information, that they work in groups of 3. And a group of 3 has to have a minimum of 2 green shirts, and then you can have a maroon shirt with that, a daily volunteer. And a lot of times the daily volunteers are very, very useful in just recording the data, while the green shirts, the people that have gone through the training, actually determine the identification, the measurements, etc. In most of the communities, except for the very small ones, they were not complete inventories. They were tree surveys, and we based this off of an article. It's called "A Statistical Method for the Accurate and Rapid Sampling of Urban Street Tree Populations" by Jansen, Bassick, Swager, and Headley. It was published in the Journal of Arboriculture in July of 1992. We just modified it a little bit to include private property. But essentially what this is, it's a way of randomly selecting block segments to be inventoried, but they're weighted and then distributed around the community. So via a pre-sample, we get an idea of where most of the trees in the community would be. And in most communities, it's going to be in the residential area, and it's going to be in grid blocks, the rectangular or square blocks. And then you kind of fall into the curvilinear blocks, and then you go into the commercial areas. And so by doing it that way, when we go back to randomly select and survey the community, we have a much better idea, much more accurate idea of what the population is like for that community. As part of the process of going on to private property, we do it a little bit backwards. We send a letter. Once we've randomly selected these block segments, we find the addresses. Everything is anonymous, so it's just sent to the address and addressed to a Hibbing resident in this case, requesting that instead of saying, "May we enter your property," we give them 3 weeks to contact us to say, "No, we would rather you did not enter our property." And then we put the property on a no trespass map. It's much faster than asking for permission. So far, I've never gotten into trouble. I've had a couple people yell at me, but it's really interesting. We've also used this tactic in Minneapolis on another project. So Minneapolis, down to the smallest community, I can almost always count on about 3 to 4 people saying, "No, I'd rather you didn't come on our property." And we just say, "Fine, no problem, just give me your address, we'll stay away." So it really hasn't been an issue. And then, again, we keep constant contact with the public through the newspapers, etc., getting people involved. The more you publicize this, the more they start looking for people when they're out inventorying, they strike up conversations, and you really get the community engaged in it. That's Kieran down in the lower left, the grandson of one of our volunteers that actually helped out quite a bit in Hibbing. The puppy and the kitten have nothing to do with this. They're just to make you smile or make this more interesting. We try to train people not to give any diagnostic information or anything like that to homeowners. These people are trained to count trees, measure trees, and identify trees. That's it. If a homeowner has a question about something, sometimes the community will provide us with business cards that will connect them with the city forester or the city parks. Other times we made these little business cards that we give out to homeowners that will allow them to connect with the tree owner's manual, and most of the time it answers the questions that they have about trees in their own property. It's kind of good PR too. In the end, we put together a standardized 12-page report that we present to the communities, and in the report we have an executive summary that can be printed off. In the bottom of the executive summary, that's usually some of the more important information we're trying to get across. So for instance, in Hibbing, the proportion of publicly owned trees to privately owned trees, it's about 2.5 privately owned trees for every publicly owned tree. That's a little bit low for Minnesota. Most of Minnesota is about 3 or 4 privately owned trees for each publicly owned tree. Then we specifically look at ash, and so for instance in Hibbing on private property it made up 16%. On public property, 63% of the trees on public property. So this would be downtown, right-of-way plantings, boulevards, or ash. So it's pretty vulnerable, and we try to break everything down too, so the community can work, both in parks and boulevards, as well as getting good information to the actual citizens. So when we look at some of these statistics, for instance, this one right here, this is tree population by ownership. So this is private property, and you can see in this community that it's dominated by apple, crabapple, ash, maple, and spruce, whereas on the public property it's dominated by ash, a little bit of maple. So this, again, it's another nice perspective for communities. We look at DBH to give them an idea of the age of their community, the distribution of age. We also look at the canopy spread. And then, again, we go back to the newspapers and start promoting this information through the newspapers. One of the last things that we work with on these communities, again, is providing technical support, is keeping in mind that these communities are cash-strapped. Most communities in Minnesota have been zeroed out for local aid to government, and if they're losing a lot of trees, they're having to rob Peter to pay Paul if they want to plant any trees. So it's very difficult for them to afford expensive trees, containerized trees, balled and burlap trees. So we help them. We provide technical assistance to construct community gravel bed nurseries. So they can buy the bare root trees in the spring, put them in the gravel beds for the summer, let the roots just literally explode, and plant them in the autumn. Autumn planting in Minnesota, especially western Minnesota, is much more successful than it is spring planting. Spring planting is right before summer. Summer, you have to water a lot. Most of the trees don't make it, especially in these large-scale plantings. So here's teeny little Hendricks, Minnesota, in their gravel bed. They plant out about 75 trees a year from that gravel bed for a community of 750 people. Pretty impressive. And last year they received a community volunteer award from the State Tree Board Minnesota Shade Tree Advisory Committee. And this is what it looks like when you can get Norwegians to smile. They're happy and very proud of what they've done. So this has been one of our stellar communities. Well, it looks like we have about 2 minutes here. I am so sorry that we kind of had to rush through this and we started so late. If you do want more information on this, you can email me at the address there, johns054@umn.edu, and be more than glad to help you with anything that you would like to find out about. I'm looking down at the chat line. If anybody has a question that I can answer. Yeah, Ken just said all of this is online at minnesotatreesource.com. A lot of the communities that we're finishing up this year have not been entered on there, but that is a dedicated website. By the way, communities love that. They have this dedicated website to their community work, and it's a little bit of a nice notoriety. What size staff from the university was on this project? Depends. During the school year, I have about 6 people, 2 of them are full-time, the other 4 are undergraduate research assistants part-time. In the summer, when we really kick it and get out in the field, I've had as many as 11 people. Minnesota is a huge state, and so we usually break up into teams, and one team is going northwest to Crookston, the other is going southeast to Rochester, but we usually work in teams of 2 to 3 people. What was the public reference for the survey? Again, if you go to Journal of Agriculture, volume 18, number 4, that's July 1992, and the title of it is a Statistical Method for the Accurate and Rapid Sampling of Urban Street Tree Populations. And actually on that mintreesource.com website, I believe under resources, that entire article is listed there. Blah, 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 blah.
Well, you
Thanks
and
for
I
joining
are
me.
people that they can hear, and we can't hear them.
And I'm going to wait
So
for
that's why you
somebody
have
to type in Gary, go away,
questions in the chat pod.
since I can't hear
But
anything.
yeah, Gary, this was good information. Working with people is one of the things that, yeah, working with people is sometimes the harder thing to do than go out and.
Lots of people saying nice things.